Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. UFC 280 Charles Oliveira versus Islam Makhachev in Abu Dhabi is only a couple weeks away, and this is one of the most anticipated fight cards of the year. And yesterday I did a video called The Top 3 Reasons I Hate UFC 280. I will link that video down in the description if you want to check it out after this video. But I thought since I made that video, it was only fitting that I made another video called The Top 3 Reasons I Love UFC 280, because looking at the card, there's a lot to love about UFC 280. And this is something I may do in the future for every single UFC pay-per-view. Do a video about things I hate about it, do a video about things I love about it. If that's something you want to see in the future, let me know down in the comments. I'm also going to do, next week, I'm going to do my grading of UFC 280, where I look over the card, briefly talk about each fight, and then grade the card on a scale from 1 to 10. So make sure you subscribe to the channel if you want to check out that video next week. But there is so many reasons to love this card. And I'm not just going to go through and say, oh, I love this matchup, this is a reason I love the card. I'm going to give you more intricate thinking on the reasons I love this card. And I'm going to go from 3 to 1. 1 being the biggest reason I love UFC 280. And this is honestly like 5 things that I wrapped into 1, because I could literally talk about this number 1 reason for probably over an hour and not get bored and not run out of stuff to say, because it's just something that I cannot believe is finally happening, and I'm so hyped for it. Before I get into my top 3 reasons, though, I'm going to give you an honorable mention. And the reason this is an honorable mention, just because I felt like this was too easy to say. And I was like, this is kind of corny putting it on the reasons list, because it was like, okay, well, that's pretty obvious. So it's an honorable mention, but that is that UFC 280 is stacked. And not only is the main card stacked, the prelims are stacked. The prelims of UFC 280 are arguably better than some UFC Fight Night cards. I would say without a doubt, the prelims of UFC 280 are far superior to UFC Vegas 61, Mackenzie Dern versus Yan Xiaonan. I think the prelims of this fight card is way better than that fight card, and that's a Fight Night card with a main event and everything. I just cannot believe how good this card is, and they stacked it because it's in Abu Dhabi. They have a deal with the Abu Dhabi government, and you look at the prelims alone, the main event of the prelims, Bilal Muhammad versus Sean Brady, an amazing welterweight fight. You also have Makhmed Muradov versus Caio Borralho, amazing fight. You also have Volkan Ozdemir versus Nikita Krylov, great fight. You also have Shamil Abdurakhimov versus Jalton Almeida. I absolutely love these fights. I mean, the prelims are incredibly stacked, but the main card, 2 title fights. Charles Oliveira versus Islam Makhachev, Aljamain Sterling versus T.J Dillashaw, Petr Yan versus Sean O'Malley, Beneil Dariush versus Mateusz Gamrot, Caitlin Chookagian versus Manon Fiorot. I mean, that's an incredible main card. So that's the honorable mention, just that the card is amazing, that the prelims are amazing. From top to bottom, this is one of the best cards I've ever laid my eyes on. We don't know how it's going to turn out, but on paper, this may be the best card in UFC history. We know how it can turn out. UFC 276 was looking amazing and end up under-delivering. But on paper, UFC 280, stacked from top to bottom. You cannot miss this card. So moving on to my number 3 reason, and I talked about some of these fights, in the honorable mention that I just went over. But my number 3 reason for loving UFC 280 is a bunch of number 1 contender fights. You look at Petr Yan versus Sean O'Malley. It is a number 1 contender fight for the bantamweight division. If O'Malley beats Petr Yan, a former champion, he will be fighting the winner of Aljamain Sterling versus T.J Dillashaw for the bantamweight title. If Petr Yan wins, I believe he will fight the winner of Aljamain Sterling versus T.J Dillashaw. So how can you not love this matchup? Has massive stakes on the line. The winner is going to fight for the bantamweight title. And also what I love about it is you have that same title being defended on the card. So not only do you have the number 1 contender fight, you have the title that matches up with that number 1 contender fight on the same card. You look down, Beneil Dariush versus Mateusz Gamrot. This is arguably a number 1 contender fight as well. Outside of Alexander Volkov moving up from 145, which he may very well do, the winner of Beneil Dariush versus Mateusz Gamrot should most likely get the next lightweight title shot. And this is an amazing matchup as well. I mean, Beneil Dariush, Mateusz Gamrot, I absolutely love this matchup ever since it was announced. And the winner really should be in line for a title shot. I know they might get skipped over because Alexander Volkanovski is going to move up and try to become double champ. But either way, that doesn't change my mind. I absolutely love this matchup, and it is very high stakes. And again, you have the same title that, these guys are fighting for a number one contender spot being fought for on the card in the main event. Charles Oliveira, Islam Makhachev for the lightweight title. I love that fact that you have these number one contender fights, and then you have that very title being defended on the same card. And then even looking down, this is to a lesser extent, Belal Muhammad versus Sean Brady. I don't want to call it a number one contender fight, but it's very close, okay? It is very, very close. I think they'll probably have to win one more fight. Let me put it this way. I think the winner of Muhammad versus Brady, their next fight will be a number one contender fight. And also, Caitlin Chukagian versus Manon Fiorot. That's probably a number one contender fight, especially if Manon Fiorot wins. She will probably be fighting Valentina Shevchenko, depending on if the UFC decides to give Talia Santos a rematch. Because the flyweight division, Valentina Shevchenko has already kind of cleaned it out a bit outside of the Santos potential rematch. So that could be a number one contender fight too. So bare minimum, you basically have 3 number one contender fights, and then the Muhammad Brady fight, which I think, their next fight will be a number one contender fight. So these are a lot of very important fights on the card, and I'm really looking forward to all those fights. Moving up to my number 2 reason I absolutely love UFC 280 is the fact that we are finally seeing Sean O'Malley tested. Sean O'Malley, I've been highly critical of because the hype hasn't been warranted based on the level of opposition that he's fought. You look at his resume. He does not have a win over a fighter who's currently on the UFC roster. The only fighter that he's fought who's currently on the UFC roster is Marlon Chito Vera, and we all know what happened in that fight. He got his legs brutally chopped, then he got shucked to the ground and brutally flash KO'd with brutal ground and pound elbows, and then he was stretchered out of the cage with no serious injury. But since that loss, he's reeled off 3, I guess, impressive performances against lesser competition, and we thought at UFC 276 against Pedro Munoz, we thought we were finally going to see Sean O'Malley test it. This was the real test for O'Malley. And basically, there was not a lot of action. Sean O'Malley poked the eye of Pedro Munoz. He was unable to continue. So we really didn't get any answers. And I thought, the UFC will probably run that fight back because Pedro Munoz was a great step up in competition. I mean, he's beating Raulian Paiva, Chris Monteiro, Thomas Almeida. I mean, they're okay wins, but it was his first real step up, and now it ends controversial, and arguably Pedro Munoz won the first round, so I thought they were going to run that back. But instead, and I respect Sean O'Malley so much for this, and I also respect Petr Yan so much for this, because now Sean O'Malley, I know Pedro Munoz is no easy fight, but there is a massive difference between Pedro Munoz and Petr Yan, who's a former bantamweight champion, and in my opinion, still one of the pound-for-pound best fighters, in the UFC. I could make a case he's number 2, honestly, or number 3. I think Petr Yan is an amazing fighter. I think he's a world-class fighter. And for Sean O'Malley to go from essentially fighting Raulian Paiva and Chris Monteiro, if you exclude that Pedro Munoz fight, which essentially didn't happen because nothing really happened in that fight outside the eye poke and some leg kicks early in the first round, to jump in with Petr Yan is a massive step up in competition, and it's a massive risk because he could go out there and get starched, and then everyone's going to say, he wasn't, the skills aren't there. But he could also pull off a victory and get a title shot. But either way, barring some weird fluke injury early on or some eye poke or something weird along those lines, we're going to get an answer. Win or lose, we are going to get a clear assessment of where Sean O'Malley is. If he loses, but it's a very competitive fight, we can still say, okay, Sean O'Malley is the real deal. And we're finally going to get the answer. How good is Sean O'Malley? Because he's looked impressive against lesser competition, but now we're finally going to know. And for Petr Yan, a lot of people aren't going to give him the credit he deserves. This is a massive risk for him. To fight a guy, he's number 1 right now in the rankings. To fight a guy that's not even in the top 10. I believe Sean O'Malley's still hanging around 12 or 13 in the rankings. I mean, shout out to Petr Yan for taking that. A lot of guys, there's too many guys nowadays that are just saying, no, I'm not fighting him. He's below me in the rankings. I love Petr Yan for this. I love this matchup. But the main reason is I just can't wait to get some answers about Sean O'Malley's skill set because there's just been too many looming questions. Okay, moving on to the number one reason I love UFC 280. And this is kind of 4 reasons molded into one. I'm going to go over each one. But the first one being a UFC lightweight champion will be crowned. We currently have a vacant belt. I believe Charles Oliveira is the rightful champion, but he missed weight by a very insignificant amount of weight for UFC 274. There were some issues with the scale, and, he ended up being stripped of his belt, even though he defeated Justin Gaethje and, finished him in the first round. So I'm excited that we finally get a lightweight champion crowned again in the UFC, even though we know Charles Oliveira is still the champion. The other reason, it's a very intriguing matchup. I mean, I can't think of a fight in the last 2 to 3 years, and if you can think of one, let me know down in the comments, that I am more intrigued to see than Charles Oliveira versus Islam Makhachev. You have Islam Makhachev, who has great wrestling, great grappling, great ground and pound, decent submission skills as well, defensively responsible on the feet. And even though he's fought lesser competition, he's fought nowhere near the level of competition that Charles Oliveira has, he's looked unstoppable and he's looked dominant. And you have Charles Oliveira, who has ever-improving striking. He has great power in his hands. He has an amazing variety of attacks. And he has world-class jiu-jitsu and submission game. And he's not scared to go to his back. And Islam Makhachev, in his last few fights, and Charles Oliveira's last few fights, we've seen him, when he gets in trouble on the feet, he just falls to his back. Islam Makhachev will not be scared to follow Charles Oliveira to the ground. And that's what makes this matchup so intriguing, because I could really see it going so many different ways. And you have 2 of the best grapplers, the 2 of the best MMA grapplers we've ever seen in the UFC go against each other. And I just find this matchup so intriguing. I'm really looking forward to it. And I'm curious how it's going to play out, because for me, what makes this so intriguing is I can guess, but honestly, there's so many different ways this fight can go. And I just cannot wait for this stylistic matchup. It's my most anticipated fight of the year. The other thing is, I believe for Charles Oliveira, this is for lightweight GOAT status. And I know a lot of people are saying, he has losses on his record, and Khabib Nurmagomedov is 29-0. Khabib Nurmagomedov fought a lot of bums earlier in his career, okay? I'm not counting those bumps. I don't care about those bumps. Also, the losses that Charles Oliveira had were very early on in his career. Can a fighter not get better? And you look at the resume right now of Charles Oliveira. He's beaten the best opponents that Khabib Nurmagomedov has beaten, and he's beaten them, quicker. He beat Dustin Poirier quicker than Khabib did, and he beat Justin Gaethje quicker than Khabib did. And instead of Conor McGregor, he's beaten Michael Chandler. Okay, you can say, maybe Conor McGregor's better. That is what it is. But now, on top of all that and this long win streak he has, if he goes out there and beats Islam Makhachev, how can you not say he's the greatest lightweight of all time, especially when you have Khabib Nurmagomedov, you have Javier Mendez, and all the guys from AKA saying that Islam Makhachev is the best fighter they've ever seen, and they're hyping up the skill set of Islam Makhachev. And if Charles Oliveira goes out there and beats him, and now he adds him to this long win streak, how can you not consider Charles Oliveira as the greatest lightweight fighter of all time? I don't know how you can't. And I believe that with a win, and this is a historic fight. And I know, granted, the Justin Gaethje fight didn't count as a title defense, and now the Islam Makhachev fight doesn't count as a title defense. But in my opinion, if he wins this fight, he will have 3 title defenses. And Khabib had 3 title defenses. And I believe the level of opposition is a little bit better. And on top of that, I think the overall resume of Charles Oliveira is a little bit better. I don't care about losses from 2015 and 2014. They don't matter. It matters about sustained dominance. And I believe Khabib left a little bit too early to still be considered the lightweight GOAT if Charles Oliveira goes out there and let's say he stops Islam Makhachev. I just can't see it. And also, and I know this is like 8 reasons wrapped into the number one reason, Can you get a better storyline for this fight? You have the protege in Islam Makhachev of the former champion Khabib Nurmagomedov that never lost his belt. And this protege has a very similar fight style. And a lot of people are wondering, you know, how would Charles Oliveira versus Khabib Nurmagomedov go? This is your best opportunity to kind of get a brief glimpse into how that fight would have gone. I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but this is our chance to kind of see it. And I believe this is a better version of Tony Ferguson in Charles Oliveira versus a worse version of Khabib Nurmagomedov in Islam Makhachev. So also, in a way, you're kind of, you know, it's not the same, but you're basically getting Khabib Nurmagomedov, Tony Ferguson, a little bit, you know, different in this matchup at UFC 280 in this main event. I'm really looking forward to it. And on top of that, they're both on amazing win streaks. And also, I feel like this is Islam Makhachev's biggest test because Islam Makhachev, he hasn't fought the greatest of competition. And he's looked dominant against the fighters he's fought. But at the same time, you know, Bobby Green, Dan Hooker on short notice are the best wins you have. I know he beat our man Sarukian, but that was a long time ago. I think that was Sarukian's debut. So what does that really mean? So not only do we have a guy that's in a title fight, he's fighting for the lightweight title, but it's also the biggest test of his career. And it's against the best opponent he's ever fought in Charles Oliveira, who is probably his worst possible matchup. So I'm really intrigued in this main event. I knew that was 26 different reasons for the number one reason, but I kind of wanted to mold that all together and not make this a crazy list. But we're getting a lightweight champion. We're getting a stylistically amazing matchup. We have an amazing storyline with the Oliveira and Makhachev and Khabib storyline. And I mean, I cannot wait for this fight card. Let me know if there's any reasons you think I missed for why I love UFC 280 or something you think should be higher on the list. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.